Yeah, g'day. Can anyone explain what we saw in Melbourne on the weekend in regards to the Nazi salute, and how is that okay?
Matt?
Well, I almost can't explain it because I think all of us were really quite shocked, Eric, by what we saw in Melbourne. I think across Australia and indeed wherever that would have been seen around the world, to think that well into the 21st century, well after the Second World War, that we would see Australian people making that sort of sign and conveying that sort of message was not just shocking, it was deeply disturbing and of course very offensive. And so whilst we are very fortunate to live in a country that has freedom of speech and freedom of political expression, and we allow people to protest peacefully, and all of those things should be protected. What we saw displayed in Melbourne over the weekend, I think, has really troubled people, and understandably, and that's why I think we've seen now today the Dan Andrews government react in the way that they have around legislating against this.
There's various legislation in other states, and of course there's been legislation or laws against Nazi insignia. What about at a federal level? Is something needed?
Well, I think it's something that fits within the remit of state governments to do, so it probably doesn't need an additional overlay. It's not something that I have looked at, to be honest, Grant, but if there's a gap, then we would need to look at that. But it's that sort of activity is something that would generally fit in the remit of state parliaments.
Di, how did you feel watching that on the weekend?
Look, I think it was quite troublesome, as the Minister said. We do have the anti-discrimination law in Australia. I think that it's in 2023, and we still have that. I think the people who did that were very irresponsible, and I think that we should not obviously accept that, and we should speak out about that.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be outlawed, right? I mean, when you start limiting freedom of speech, that's a slippery slope, which at some point in the future can so easily be turned to suppress the minority. It's not about outlawing it. It's about public shaming it. It's about educating the young so that as they grow up, they don't do it. I mean, what's more powerful, outlawing it or having, say, a 15-year-old daughter see her father on the news undertaking this act and saying, "Dad, oh my God, was that you?" What's more powerful? It's really education. It's not outlawing.
Brian is a Jewish person as well. Person of Jewish
I
heritage.
am Jewish, but I'm not saying this as a Jewish person. I'm saying this as a human being.
So you're saying it as an American. America doesn't.
That's exactly right.
You ask a German, they ban Nazi insignia because they lived under the Nazis. You ask any countryman from Europe, they ban it. Britain doesn't. But gosh, when you're a judge, you can increase the sentence if there's a race-related motive.
Should it be banned, though,
You've got to be very careful in drafting your law, because you have to, otherwise you're going to be banning Charlie Chaplin and the Great Dictator.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. And what is important is
that you can draft something that goes to outlawing something that is such a hateful act, represents
if it's
something
intended to cause hatred.
So how do you do that effectively?
Well, you just say intended to cause hatred in your law. But I think we need to go further. There were 30 young men in black, total black, in front of the Victorian Parliament. It'd be nice to know where they came from. Are they the St Kilda young liberals imitating Mr Perrottet when he was 20? We don't. So be careful what you wish for in this. We need to tackle the causes that are producing, from under a rock, these people. And interestingly enough, it was in support of someone who was ratcheting up hatred against trans people. And I think that's the key. If you need Nazis to support your cause, it's a rotten cause.
I'll just come to Kirsten in just a moment, but I just want to pursue this with you, Geoffrey, as well, because we know that there are bans at a state or territory level against public displays of Nazi symbols. It exists in New South Wales. That come into force in 2022. Queensland government plans to introduce proposed laws to ban Nazi symbols as well, including tattoos. Other states are looking at this. It does then raise the question, what else, doesn't it? For instance, you talked about the United States. Does a Confederate flag, which can be so associated with slavery and racism, a symbol that the Ku Klux Klan used, also be banned? Does that also raise that question, Geoffrey?
Yes, of course. And America has dealt with it on the whole sensibly when Trump left office, and is now moving a lot of these old statues to museums where they belong as part of the history of racism in America. And one could say it in Australia, where our history of racism, going back to the founding fathers, who were they all thought like Pauline Hanson, and they were, the first law they ever passed was the White Australia policy, and you have people like Alfred Deakin, who actually told the country that Aboriginals would be erased from
Within 100 years.
No more tinted people. So that was the
Well, that didn't
kind
work.
of people.
It didn't work. We're here,
Didn't work.
Kirsten.
We're still
We're
here.
here. So how do you feel about that as a Wiradjuri woman, taking into account what we saw on the weekend, what Geoffrey has to say, but also the point that Brian made, that banning it may not be the way to go?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I did want to come back to what you said, Brian, is making I guess, a mockery of these people, yes, a very good learning opportunity for those watching, but why are we letting it get to that point? Why aren't we stopping it before these things kind of happen, so we don't have these big spectacles and we don't have people walking the streets fearing for their lives? And if you look at the footage, who was being protected that day? That's a really big question that I think is really important here too. You look at the footage and it's the people who are being directly threatened with their lives who are being pushed away, and didn't look like they were actually being protected by the police force that were there.
I'll put that to Brian, just in response to that, if it's who deserves protection, I suppose? People protected from hateful symbols and hate speech, or people's right to actually express those views?
Unfortunately, both. Because the only way that you can have a true democracy is if you protect hateful speech, as long as it's not immediately inciting illegal act, as long as it's not immediately inciting some kind of destructive activity. But beyond that, it's through education. It's through the cultural environment that you want to change attitudes so that there isn't an uprising of that sort. That's a more powerful and more lasting approach than just making a ban. Because if you make a ban, you're not changing the hearts and minds of the very people whose act you are now trying to ban. They've got the same mindset, and in fact, for some, it'll fire them up and have more who want to follow in their footsteps merely because they want to go against the authority, the legislative ban. So there's an underlying problem, and that's what needs to be addressed more systemically than just saying, let's ban the activity.
I'll just go back to Eric, because Eric, this is something that's close to your family as well. Your father had lived through Nazi occupation.
Yeah, so he was a Dutch teenager and got sent to a labour camp in Germany during World War II. And he never forgot the war.
How do you feel on that question? We've raised both sides of this, whether banning it is a right idea or the wrong idea. Where do you land?
Not being rude to the gentleman next to you, but I think Australia's a little bit smarter. Like, we've got our issues in Australia, and I understand he doesn't want to ban it, but I don't know. Like, have a look at the equality in the room here. Like, I feel Australian cities, we get on pretty well.
So we could do without that, in your view? Yeah.
Yeah.